Story 1. Someone's living in my house. The footsteps upstairs shouldn't have been there. Emma was house sitting for her aunt in Phoenix, and she was supposed to be alone. It was almost midnight when she heard them. Slow, heavy steps walking from room to room above her head. Emma froze in the kitchen, her homework scattered on the table, listening to someone moving around upstairs like they owned the place. Emma grabbed a knife from the drawer and crept up the stairs. Her hands were shaking as she checked every room. Empty. All of them. But when she got to her aunt's bedroom, the closet door was wide open. She knew she had closed it earlier because the hanging clothes were bugging her. That's when she saw the muddy footprints on the carpet, leading from the window straight to where she was standing. The police found something that made Emma sick to her stomach. Down in the basement, behind some old boxes, someone had been living there. There was a mattress, empty food cans, and a notebook filled with notes about Emma's daily routine. What time she ate dinner, when she took showers, what TV shows she watched. Someone had been watching her for weeks, learning everything about her, and she never knew. They never caught the guy. Emma still can't sleep without checking every closet and corner in whatever place she's staying. Story 2. The Woman in White. Mike was driving home from his night shift job in rural Montana when he saw her, a woman in a white dress, standing right in the middle of the empty road. It was snowing hard, and she was just standing there, in the freezing cold like she didn't feel it. Mike slowed down his truck and rolled down the window. The woman looked about 30. Really pale, and she was shivering but not moving. Mike got out to help her, but that's when he noticed something weird. There were no footprints in the snow around her. The snow was perfect and untouched in every direction, but there she was, standing right in the middle of it. Mike asked if she was okay, but she didn't answer. She just stared at him with these empty, dark eyes. When he got closer, he could see her lips were blue, and her feet were bare. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she was ice cold, colder than the air around them. Then she spoke, but her voice sounded like it was coming from far away. She said, "I've been waiting so long." Mike asked what she was waiting for, and she smiled this horrible smile and said, "For someone to take me home." That's when Mike noticed the car wreck, about 50 feet off the road, covered in snow like it had been there for months. The front end was completely smashed into a tree. Mike looked back at the woman, but she was gone, just gone. When the police came, they told Mike that car had been there since November. The driver was a 30-year-old woman who died on impact. She had been wearing a white dress, and her body was never found. Story 3. The Thing in the Basement. Sarah moved into an old rental house in Salem, Oregon, because it was cheap and close to her job. The house was built in the 1940s and had this creepy basement that the landlord told her to just use for storage. The first few weeks were normal, but then Sarah started hearing scratching sounds coming from below the kitchen floor. At first, she thought it was mice, or maybe the old pipes making noise. The scratching got louder every night. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way up through the floorboards. Sarah finally got brave enough to go down to the basement with a flashlight. The basement was damp and smelled like something had died down there. She followed the scratching sound to the far corner where there was this old wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It was locked, but the scratching was definitely coming from behind. Sarah asked her landlord about the door, but he got really weird and told her to stay out of that part of the basement. That just made her more curious. She found the key hidden on top of the water heater and opened the door. Inside was a small room with dirt walls and a dirt floor. The scratching stopped as soon as she opened the door. In the middle of the room was a hole in the ground, about 3 feet wide, and so deep her flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. Around the hole were dozens of deep scratches in the dirt, like something had been trying to climb out for years. Sarah moved out the next day. 2 weeks later, she read in the local paper that the house had been condemned. Workers had found human bones in that hole, and the scratches weren't from something trying to get out. They were from someone trying to get it. The police think someone had been living in the tunnels under the house, and Sarah had been sleeping right above them every night. Story 4. The phone calls. Jenny lived alone in a small apartment in Denver, and every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., her phone would ring. It had been going on for 2 months. When she answered, there was never anyone there, just this weird breathing sound and sometimes what sounded like whispering in a language she didn't understand. Jenny tried blocking the number, but it kept calling from different numbers. The calls started getting longer. Instead of hanging up after a few seconds, whoever it was would stay on the line for minutes, just breathing. Jenny could hear other sounds in the background, like someone was outside her building, maybe in the parking lot. She started recording the calls and played them for her friend, who spoke Spanish. Her friend turned pale and told Jenny that the whispering wasn't Spanish. It wasn't any language she recognized, but it sounded like someone was saying her name over and over. One night, Jenny decided not to answer the phone. It rang, and rang for almost an hour straight. Around 4 a.m., the ringing finally stopped. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Someone was trying to open her front door. The doorknob was turning back and forth, and she could hear whoever it was breathing heavily on the other side. Jenny called 911, but by the time the police arrived, no one was there. The next morning, Jenny found something taped to her door. It was a photo of her sleeping in her bed, taken from inside her apartment. On the back was written, "I've been watching you sleep." Jenny moved out that day and stayed with friends. The calls followed her to her new place. They still call her, even now, 5 years later, always at 3:17 a.m. Always the same breathing, always the same whispered words she can't understand, but knows are about her. Story 5. The camping trip. 4 friends went camping in the woods, outside Asheville, North Carolina, for a long weekend. Tom, Lisa, Brad and Amy had done this trip every summer for years, always going to the same remote campsite, about 5 miles from the nearest road. They knew the area well and felt safe there. On the second night, they were sitting around the campfire when they heard something moving in the trees around their campsite. At first they thought it was just a deer, or maybe a raccoon looking for food, but whatever it was kept circling their camp, staying just outside the light from their fire. They could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling, like something big was moving out there. Tom grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but all they could see were trees and darkness. The noises got closer. They could hear what sounded like footsteps, but they were too heavy and slow to be from any animal they knew. Lisa suggested they get in their tents, but Brad thought they should investigate. As he stood up, something threw a rock at their fire, scattering sparks everywhere. Then another rock, and another. They weren't small rocks either. They were big enough to hurt someone if they got hit. The 4 friends grabbed their flashlights and tried to see what was throwing the rocks, but their lights couldn't reach far enough into the trees. That's when they heard the voice. Someone was out there, calling their names one by one, not shouting, but saying their names in this calm, creepy voice, like they were being invited to come closer. The voice knew all their names, even though they were miles from any other people. They packed up their stuff as fast as they could and hiked back to their car in the dark. When they got home and developed the photos from their trip, they found something in the background of one picture that they hadn't seen when they took it. Standing between the trees, barely visible, was the shape of a person watching them. They never went camping together again. Story 6. The new apartment. When Marcus moved into his new apartment in Chicago, the previous tenant left behind some weird stuff. There was a pile of old newspapers from the 1980s, some candles, and a bunch of mirrors covered with sheets. Marcus thought it was just junk, and threw most of it away, but he kept the mirrors because they were nice and probably expensive. The first strange thing Marcus noticed was that his reflection looked different in those mirrors. Not completely different, but like he was standing at a weird angle, even when he was standing straight. Sometimes it looked like there was someone else in the reflection, just barely visible behind him. Marcus figured it was just the old glass playing tricks on his eye, but then he started waking up to find the mirrors had been moved. During the night, he would hang one in the bedroom, and in the morning, it would be in the living room. He lived alone, and always locked his door, so there was no way someone else was moving.
Marcus thought maybe he was sleepwalking, so he set up a camera to record himself sleeping. The video showed Marcus sleeping normally all night, but around 3 a.m., one of the mirrors started moving by itself. It slowly slid across the wall like invisible hands were carrying it. In the mirror's reflection, Marcus could see someone standing at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep. But when he looked at the actual footage of his bed, there was no one there. Only in the mirror's reflection could you see the figure. Marcus got rid of all the mirrors the next day, but it was too late. He still sees the figure, sometimes in other reflective surfaces, in windows, in his car's rearview mirror, in the screen of his phone, when it's turned off. Always standing behind him, always watching. The previous tenant who left the mirrors. Marcus found out later that he had died in the apartment. Suicide. He was found in front of one of those mirrors. Story 7. The babysitter. 16-year-old Katie was babysitting for the Johnsons like she did every Friday night. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood in suburban Dallas, and Katie had been babysitting their 2 kids, ages 6 and 8, for almost a year. The kids were already asleep when she arrived, so Katie settled in to do her homework and watch TV. Around 10 p.m., the house phone rang. Katie answered, expecting it to be Mrs. Johnson checking in, but there was no one on the line, just silence. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time Katie could hear someone breathing, but they wouldn't say anything. She hung up and tried to focus on her homework, but the phone kept ringing every 15 or 20 minutes. On the 4th call, Katie heard a man's voice. He asked, "Have you checked on the children?" Katie was confused and asked who it was, but the man just repeated, "Have you checked on the children?" and hung up. Katie went upstairs to check on the kids. They were both sleeping peacefully in their beds, so she went back downstairs. The calls kept coming, and each time the man asked the same question, "Have you checked on the children?" Katie was getting scared and thought about calling the police, but she didn't want to overreact. On the 10th call, the man's voice was different. Angry, he said, "You should have checked on the children." Katie ran upstairs to the kids' rooms, and both children were gone. Their beds were empty, windows still locked, no signs of a struggle. Katie called 9. When the police arrived and searched the house, they found the children in the basement, unharmed but scared. They said a man had come into their rooms and told them to hide downstairs until their parents came home. The man knew their names, knew details about their family, and promised he wouldn't hurt them if they stayed quiet. The police never found any sign of how the man got into the house, and he was never caught. The children couldn't describe what he looked like because he was wearing a mask. Katie never babysat again. Story 8. The college dorm. Freshman year at Ohio State. Roommates Jake and Chris thought they had it made. Their dorm room was bigger than most, and it was at the end of the hall where it was quiet. What they didn't know was why their room was bigger, and why previous students had requested room changes. I mentioned that the room had been empty for most of the previous semester, but didn't explain why. The weird stuff started in October. Jake and Chris would come back to their room to find their belongings moved around, books rearranged on shelves, clothes folded differently, their beds made in a way they never made them. At first they blamed each other, thinking one of them was playing pranks, but they were never in the room at the same times when these things happened. Then they started hearing typing sounds at night, like someone was using a computer keyboard, but both of their laptops were closed and turned off. The typing would go on for hours, always starting around 2 a.m. They tried recording the sound, but their phones and cameras would mysteriously run out of battery even when they were fully charged before going to sleep. One night, Chris woke up to see someone sitting at the desk in their room, typing on a computer that wasn't. The figure looked like a student, about their age, but Chris couldn't see his face clearly. The typing stopped, and the figure turned around. Chris saw that half of the person's face was missing, like it had been badly burned. The figure stood up and walked toward Chris's bed, but when Jake turned on the lights, no one was there. They found out from older students that their room had been occupied 3 years earlier by a student named David, who died in a fire in that exact room. He had been working on his computer late at night when an electrical fire started from his overloaded power strip. David died trying to save his final paper that was due the next day. Jake and Chris moved to a different dorm the next week. but other students report that the typing sounds still happen, and David is still trying to finish that paper. Story 9. The road trip. Best friends Amanda and Rachel were driving from Seattle to Los Angeles for spring break. They had planned the perfect road trip with stops at cool places along the way. On their second day, somewhere in rural Oregon, they took a wrong turn and ended up on a small highway they'd never heard of. Their GPS wasn't working, and they hadn't seen another car or any signs of civilization for over an hour. That's when they saw the gas station. It looked old, like something from the 1950s, but the lights were on, and there was a car parked outside. Amanda and Rachel were relieved because they were almost out of gas, and their phones had no signal. They pulled up to the pump, and an older man came out to help them. He was friendly but seemed odd, like he was trying too hard to be normal. While the man pumped their gas, Rachel went inside to use the bathroom and buy some snacks. The inside of the store was just as old-fashioned as the outside, and the shelves were stocked with products she'd never seen before. The brands looked familiar, but wrong, like knockoff versions of things she knew. The candy bars had names like Snackers instead of Snickers and Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. When Rachel tried to pay, the cashier, a woman about the same age as the man outside, asked for $3.50 for gas and snacks that should have cost at least $20. Rachel was confused but didn't want to argue about paying less money. As they drove away, Amanda and Rachel both felt like something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. 2 hours later, they finally reached a normal town and stopped at a real gas station. When Amanda opened her wallet to pay, instead of the receipt from the weird gas station, there was an old newspaper clipping. It was about a gas station that had burned down in 1973, killing the owner. The photo in the newspaper showed the same man and woman who had helped them, and the gas station in the photo looked exactly like the one they had just left. Amanda and Rachel drove straight back to that highway to find the gas station again, but all they found was an empty lot with the concrete foundation of a building that had been demolished decades ago. Story 10. The final warning. This last story happened just 6 months ago to a woman named Patricia in a small town outside of Portland, Maine. Patricia was a nurse who worked the night shift at the local hospital. She lived alone in a house she had inherited from her grandmother, and she loved the quiet, peaceful neighborhood where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. One evening after work, Patricia found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. It was handwritten and said, "You have 7 days." No signature, no explanation, just those 5 words. Patricia thought it was some kind of joke, or maybe a mistake, so she threw the note away and didn't think much about it. The next day, there was another note, this time on her front door. "You have 6 days." Patricia started to worry and asked her neighbors if they had seen anyone around her house or car, but no one had noticed anything unusual. She decided to install a security camera to see who was leaving the notes. The notes kept coming, counting down each day. "You have 5 days. You have 4 days." Patricia watched her security camera footage every morning, but the cameras never caught anyone approaching her house or car. The notes just appeared like someone invisible was leaving them. On day 4, Patricia called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do about anonymous notes unless she was physically threatened. "You have 3 days. You have 2 days." Patricia was terrified and stayed with her sister, but the notes followed her there. She found them on her car, even though she had parked in her sister's locked garage. "You have 1 day." Patricia spent that entire day with her family, surrounded by people, never alone for even a minute. On the 7th day, no note came. Patricia thought maybe whoever was doing this had given up or gotten bored. She went back to her house that evening, feeling relieved, but when she walked into her living room, every wall was covered with photos of her at work, at home, sleeping, showering, eating. Hundreds of photos taken over months without her knowing. In the middle of all the photos, written in red paint on her wall, were the words, "Your 7 days are up. Now I can come inside." Patricia moved across the country the next week. She's never found out who was watching her or what they wanted, but sometimes, in her new house in Arizona, she still finds photos of herself that she never took, slipped under her door when she's not home. The note stopped, but whoever was watching her apparently followed her across the country. She's learned to live with always looking over her shoulder, always checking locks twice, always wondering if today might be the day that her mysterious stalker decides that watching isn't enough anymore. These 10 stories remind us that horror isn't just in movies or books, it's in the real world, happening to real people who thought they were safe. The next time you hear a strange noise in your house, find something moved that you know you didn't move, or get that feeling that someone is watching you. Remember these stories, because sometimes that feeling is right, sometimes you really aren't alone, and sometimes the most terrifying thing about a horror story is that it's true.